Hello. In episode 33, season 2 of Heirs for Architecture, I spoke with Ben Derbyshire, chair of HTA and immediate past president of RIBA, the Royal Institute of British Architects, about his recent book, Home Truths, published in 2022 by Hatch Editions.
When I took my position at the RIBA, it was actually quite a scary job. You're very much in the limelight, and there are some people for you and a lot of people against you. And the understanding that we are essentially in a place which is political, that is to say, in our work and in the buildings that we are responsible for, expressions of political outcomes that we may not ourselves have created, and indeed that we may not ourselves agree with. But essentially, our work is the outcome of a political expression. So, we can't duck that proposition, and we can't duck the morality that goes with that.
A is for Architecture, a podcast about architecture, buildings, urban culture and space.
Hello and welcome to another episode of A is for Architecture. I'm talking today to Ben Derbyshire, architect and writer. Ben, would you be so kind as to introduce yourself a little more fully than that?
Okay, well, it's great to be here. Thank you very much indeed for having me and for featuring my book, Home Truths. So my day job is to be the chair of HTA Design LLP, which is a 250-strong multidisciplinary practice with studios in London, Edinburgh, Manchester and Bristol. I'm a commissioner at Historic England, which is an increasing involvement for me with various different and fascinating roles for them. And I suppose the other significant thing to mention is that I'm a past president of the RIBA. I sat in that hot seat between 2018 and 19, yeah.
Fabulous. Yeah, obviously, I think people will know you quite well as being the RIBA president. And also, obviously, as leading HTA, which you've done for many years, since the 19...
Well, I joined HTA as a Part 1 student. It was called Hunt Thompson Associates then, just about 4 years after Bernard Hunt and John Thompson founded the practice, whilst they were still studying architecture at Cambridge. So I joined in 1973. So this year marks my 50th in the organization, which, as I say, has changed in nature somewhat, although it's always had a focus on designing mostly residential places.
Right. And residential at scale. If you're, obviously working with, I assume, both commercial and local authorities / social housing providers.
Yes. Well, we started life when I joined as a shopfront practice in Parkway, Camden Town. And most of our clients were, what I guess were then the urban pioneers of Camden Town. I mean, Camden Town took off as a great place to live once the steam marshalling yards of Euston disappeared and gave way to diesel and electric propulsion, and it made the environment possible to live in. And so it was kind of in the middle of a burgeoning period of gentrification, I suppose, and our early clients were musicians, artists, filmmakers, and so on, who were doing up houses in and around. So we started always, working for housing clients, and when we came to mass housing, and our first projects were for housing associations and local authorities, and for the local authorities in particular, we wanted to replicate that relationship with our clients by using techniques of social research in order to create a basis for communication with very large numbers of people of a kind which related, at least in some way, to the intimate relationships we had with our first housing clients.
I see. So there's sort of been a development of a technique, shall we say, of social engagement to produce, because as you mentioned at the beginning, there's this excellent book that you've written, Home Truths, Hatch Editions, published this year, isn't it?
Yeah, only we published in January, yeah.
Published in January, which has a great focus on two things. Obviously, HTA's work, and your reflections on it as a senior practitioner of long-standing and as a guide, I suppose, or president of the RIBA, but also on the idea of common values of ordinary people in the articulation development of meaningful, sustainable architecture, housing architecture. Is that fair?
It is an important theme, but I think I'll go back a step and say why I wrote it.
Yes, please.
I wrote it because, 50 years as an architect specializing in housing and placemaking, a phrase coined, by the way, by one of our founding partners, Bernard Hunt. And I wrote it because I felt the necessity for providing young practitioners with some sort of a framework based on the invaluable experience that I've had, which kind of picks up from the beginning of the decline of the profession's influence in the 1970s, and has now reached a point of kind of maximum dislocation, disorientation, and for me, the almost universally held belief that the housing market is dysfunctional, and on the left and right, everyone is deeply concerned about our ability to deliver high quality housing. And for me, I wanted to establish, first of all, a reflection on the history, but then some ideas about the future basis on which the professions, planning and architecture, can positively influence outcomes in this vital field. And a stimulus for all of this, I'm going to quote from actually the first chapter, the first page of the first chapter, where Raphael Moneo, who I went along while I was president of the RIBA to the inaugural John Soane Memorial Lecture at the Soane Museum. And he said, "Today, social housing is perhaps the most neglected architectural field, abandoned to market forces without any concern to develop new approaches. The utopian goals that were still alive in the recent past are now definitively gone." And for such a distinguished architect to be making such a radical statement, potentially immensely disheartening for those embarking on the profession. There was another quote, which I didn't include in the book. Sir David Chipperfield said not so very long ago that involvement in the design of housing should be of only academic interest to any self-respecting architect. So I thought, well, this isn't good enough. I want to try to create a construct, an understanding, a way of looking at what our potential contribution is to improving people's lives through the design of places and housing in such a way as to motivate people to be enthusiastically involved for the future. That involved, for me, setting out some of the history. I mean, going back into the 19th century and the social reformers, and the battle between, the market forces driving the way we plan the places that we live, and the reformers' understanding that it was a question of enlightened self-interest to provide well-designed environments for workers to live in, and then that being taken up ultimately in the post-war years, especially with the national provision of both planning and council housing. So I've been into all of that historical background for young practitioners in order to provide. I've prepared some common ground between the way I think and the first chapter, Lessons from Utopia, is 5 movements from the 20th century, which I think create the zeitgeist, a platform for where we begin now at the beginning of the 21st century. And then I go on beyond. So back to your question, the relationship between the consumer of housing and the providers of housing despite our enthusiasm for so-called community architecture in the early years of my practicing life, and despite quite a bit of theoretical understanding around this, Sherry Austin's ladder of engagement and all of that, there's still a long way to go in order to create a real basis for a meaningful relationship between consumers and providers of housing, in the ways that so many other industries are routinely doing.
Yes, I think that's a really clear description of it. And do you think David Chipperfield was being ironic?
Well,
I can only hope.
I tell you what. So another quote I'll give you,
because Raphael Moneo, you can't but agree with Raphael Moneo. Like as you were saying, housing is the issue of our age. I mean, we've got other ones. Obviously, we've had COVID, and obviously we've got health inequalities and various. But it all, it's the kind of diamond tip cutting edge of inequality is housing.
Couldn't agree more. Well, look, I don't think he was being ironic, actually. But to clarify my understanding of what he must have meant, is that the means of delivery is so complicated and has been so hijacked by the profit motive, and stripped of its value by the speculation that exists, particularly in the purchase and selling of land, which is the very underpinning of being able to provide people with good places to live, that it is actually extremely difficult to do a good job. But so my book really is a cry of nil desperandum. There are approaches, and at the same time as there are multiple crises. The crisis of inequity, as you say, the crisis in health and well-being, the crisis in affordability, the crisis of lack of supply of how these are multiple crises, and another crisis, which of course is the emptying out of our town centres. So these are fundamental problems that lie between us in creating equity and social well-being for people. And my argument is that as an antidote to what I regard as being, the post-war decline in the role of the profession, is to reassert the opportunity for us to influence better outcomes, and to continually argue that point until somebody listens. No accounting, as I say, in the management of my business, there's no accounting for the benefits of repetition.
You made when you were elected the president in 2016, you stated that you were going to build upon the work of your predecessor in sort of re-engaging practice with everyday life. Now, it's not quite exactly what you said, but I was just reading it before we started recording, and then I lost the link because I'm always losing links somewhere, about what you intended for this particular role. Because I think one of the things that it strikes me, and this difference between Raphael Moneo and David Chipperfield's perspective on these things, as you say, I suspect there's subtlety within that radical, that sort of jangling comment from Chipperfield. But it seems to me that when you were elected RIBA president, and this book and the work of your practice, the practice which you head, is very much trying to imbue the profession of architecture with a moral or ethical, perhaps is moral makes people's skin prickle, but ethical responsibility, which seems in many ways across the latter half of the 20th century and into the first years of the 21st to have been abandoned. I remember doing a talk when I was about 10 years ago now, I think, and a head of school from a leading architecture school in the UK actually said in front of a room full of packed students that they didn't think that architecture had a moral response, an ethical duty.
Okay, well, I want to respond to some of that. First of all, I think I felt skin prickles on the question of morality, but really only when people don't like your brand of morality. It's incredibly important to take a moral position. It seems to me. I think that the lesson of the decline of the profession, and I'm sorry to keep saying that, but we have to recognize that a very small percentage of the built environment has anything much to do with our contribution. And mass housing, especially speculative mass housing, is completely untouched, by professional practice, pretty much as we know it. Anyway, so my proposition there is that the profession has essentially marketed itself into a corner. And when I talk in my practice about marketing, I don't mean showing off. I don't mean glossy public relations. I don't mean any of that. I mean anticipating the needs of society by equipping yourself to meet them ahead of when society understands that requirement is upon them. And for me, it's not just a moral question. It's a question of enabling society to benefit from the skills that people like you are equipping young professionals with. And what we have to do is create circumstances, in education and in practice, and an understanding amongst the providers of housing and the policymakers that govern the providers of housing, that brings us more into the picture, that creates a relevant contribution for the profession to make. Now, so we've got to move, and I think it's completely wrong where, I've always riled at the idea that our job is to educate society. Our job is to anticipate the needs of society, educate ourselves, equip ourselves with the necessary skills and resources to meet those needs. Now, back to the question of politics. When I took my position at the RIBA, it was actually quite a scary job. You're very much in the limelight, and there are some people for you and a lot of people against you. And the understanding that we are essentially in a place which is political, that is to say, we are, in our work and in the buildings that we are responsible for, expressions of political outcomes that we may not ourselves have created, and indeed that we may not ourselves agree with. But essentially, our work is the outcome of a political expression. So, we can't duck that proposition, and we can't duck the morality that goes with that. So I completely disagree, with whoever it was who said to your audience of presumably students, there is
young impressionable students. Yeah, I know.
Yeah, exactly. No, it's very important to understand that we have a contribution to make and work hard to be able to make it.
I think this is, this idea of the anticipation of needs is, it's really great to hear it, because one of the things I've noticed as an educator in architecture is that we still, as a profession, the way I put it is that we walk backwards. We're always looking to the past. We're still referencing books that were written in the 1920s as relevant to the context now, which is radically absurd, and you can't imagine any other serious profession doing so. I mean, if medicine was still referencing stuff they were doing in the 1920s, like sawing people's legs off with giant saws and injecting people with tuberculosis for kicks, I don't know what they did in the 1920s, but that probably wasn't that good. But instead, this idea of anticipating needs. But how do we do that? How is that done? Like, how does one go about anticipating needs as a profession, when, particularly in relation to the funding of the profession, the way the business of architecture operates, there's very little money up front. It's all, the actual commercial model doesn't.
Well, first of all, you've a couple of, if not several points there, but I mean, just on the question of looking backwards, I mean, that's why even before I get to my Maneo quote, I'm on Minu Masani and his. I've always thought very, very witty proposition. That in the end, all the isms become wasms, which I've always loved, and also that the obsession with stylistic loyalties in the profession is just a ludicrous idea. I mean, and that's quite handy as the president of the RIBA to be able to say, well, I'm a complete Catholic when it comes to tastes. I can love traditional architecture just as much as I can love good modern architecture. It really doesn't bother me at all, because actually there's something much, much, much more important, and this comes onto your point about anticipating needs. We have to. Our practice, as Hunt Thompson as it was then, we were the first, and I suspect only practice ever, to set up our own social research subsidiary. It was called Urban, Social and Environmental Research, which spells user as an acronym. Did I say? Anyway, never mind. It spells user as an acronym, not an anachronism, as an acronym. And far from being an anachronism, I mean, it was the fundamental means by which we, as I said at the beginning of this conversation, replicated the individual relationship we had with private clients who wanted us to make nice homes for them out of Victorian terraces, by and large, to a basis on which we could understand the needs and aspirations of large populations of people who were from a completely different background, both to ourselves and to our previous clients, mostly working class people. And, for me, there's incredibly important lessons in all of that. First of all, you do learn what matters to people. And you learn, moreover, that what matters to people most are in common, the fundamental things for a good life. They are not aesthetic questions. They are not preferences for things that look as if they were built in the 18th century, or indeed were the outcomes of modernism. Nothing to do with it at all. It's all to do with enabling people to have a good life, with things like the ability to live healthily, and to access work, and to travel affordably, and to have space and adaptability for their children to grow and develop in their home and do their homework, and all of that stuff. That's what really matters to people. And when we were able to evidence that and quantify it, then we had a basis for making the projects that we did in mass housing. Now, to be honest with you, it was a bit of a golden era. That it was an era when local authorities were still investing large amounts of time and money in renovating their housing stock. And, when I say that the housing market is broken, and almost everybody understands that from the left and the right, the fact of the matter is that local authorities are hardly able to spend any money in a significant way at all on housing their citizens now. And that's another reason I wrote the book. This must change. And when it changes, we must, be in a position to understand that it's possible to anticipate the needs of the people that we are trying to provide for, and that there are techniques for doing so.
That's, but one of the things that strikes me reading your book is that there is, even though you say the what people want is to be able to live a good life, are there, as an architect, for architects, are there in your long career and in the work of the urban, social and environmental research, HDA's kind of foundations within community engagement participation, are there, or don't, aesthetics and materials and participatory practices, aren't they instrumental to the way that people understand these things? Is it really that irrelevant? I mean, if you stick people in...
I'm not saying it's irrelevant. I'm just saying...
If you stick them in Robin Hood gardens, it kind of makes them depressed.
Well, so you say that But I mean, Richard Rogers, of course, asserted that the demolition of Robin Hood Gardens was at about the same level as demolishing the Georgian crescents of Bath. So not everybody agrees with you about that.
But the residents did. I mean, 85% of the residents wanted it knocked down.
Yeah, okay, and it is being knocked down, and Historic England, of which I am now a commissioner, refused to list it. So I mean, I think there is a shared view about all of that, a consensus anyway, despite the particular views of some in the profession, such as Rogers. Anyway, no, don't get me wrong. Beauty matters. And funnily enough, I've just been writing about this because we're keen to try and influence the next government to understand these things properly. But I think the Vitruvian proposition about beauty is fundamental. That commodity, firmness, and delight are in equal measure necessary in order to create beautiful outcomes. And if you talk about a beautiful life, you're talking about ways in which people can live, with nature, with each other, in spaces, and conveniently. And it's appropriate to talk about a beautiful life, in which the physical artifacts that surround it are also beautiful. But for me, the most important thing is the life, not the artifact. Of course, the artifact should be beautiful. The problem is that I think the current policymaking in this area, slightly hijacked by people of a kind of reactionary frame of mind, with the inevitable proposition that beauty is in the eye of the beholder, have plumped for a version of beauty which is not only 1920s. I think we're talking about 1720s. As the origin of their ideal, and of course it isn't like that. It was never like that, and it never will be. And that's why beauty is much more complicated, as I was quoted as saying recently in the AJ, than simply giving the public the proposition of choosing between something that looks like it was built in the 18th century and something that looks like it was built in the middle of the 20th century. That is a completely misleading proposition.
Yeah, I mean, I went to Poundbury a while ago. I happened upon it. It was brilliant. Obviously, it was because it was extraordinary. But it's like a sort of strange historicism plus SUVs, and with no horse shit everywhere, because this is the thing that no one, you look at the Georgian squares, you must have been ankle deep in the stuff. So it's kind of, well, it's true, isn't it?
Yeah.
There's the great horse muck crisis of the late 1800s. It was it's funny. So we've got this very kind of pristine idea of what that is, and then we try and replicate this kind of pristine and essentially suburbanite idea. And again, I'm very Catholic in my tastes with regards to architecture, but it is quite a funny one. How has the profession started to recognize this? So obviously an HTA, and you see this in other practices. I've spoken to Alex Ely at May, and I've spoken to various other people who are involved in that kind of New London vernacular, that kind of brick-like, mid-rise kind of things. Is this the way that the profession is starting to represent or reflect on these issues? Is it finding a kind of common ground between public appetite, volume house builders who, for all of their challenges, are producing products that sell, which is more than can be said for a lot of architectural practice?
Well, come on. I mean, the volume house builders manage to sell what they build because they build so little. They create a desperate imbalance in supply and demand, and you could almost sell anything. And I think they've proved that perfectly well. No, I don't quite agree with you on this. Elsewhere in the book, I'm so glad I've written this book because it's been my opportunity towards the end of a career to think it through.
Yeah.
What we have in our practice, and I think is increasingly widely understood, is that success lies for designers, planners, and designers in housing, and generally, actually, is that you need to become what we call, for shorthand, designers in industry. That is to say, designers who understand the industrial complex that is delivering, but also understand it in such a way that it's increasingly able to meet the demands that society and the challenges, the crises, are placing upon us. And for me, examples of that, and architects love examples from the motor car industry for some reason, but if you take somebody like André Lefebvre, who designed the 2CV, and then also the wonderful Citroën DS.
The most beautiful car in the world.
Precisely, although actually it was a sculptor that made its shape. But anyway, it was André Lefebvre who created the technical underpinnings. They were able to do that because they understood the means of production, and in particular advances in means of production that were enable radical improvement. Famously, the shell of the Mini had all its seams welded on the outside, not the inside, and that all of that. And the lesson that we're learning from industrialized production of housing in HTA is that it is the only way, the only place that we're able to meet what was at one time the government's industrial strategy targets before they were scrapped by Cameron. And those targets were to double the speed of provision, halve the cost, and halve the amount of embodied carbon in the built product that we make. Now, we're only able to do that because we've developed relationships, as many other practices have in different spheres, with producers. And we have learnt, we've understood the means of production sufficiently to be able to deliver our expertise, which is an expertise based on an understanding of human need, to deliver housing. We are not the technical innovators, but we are able to work closely with technical innovators, people who design factories, design production lines that make housing. We're able to work with them in such a way as to produce a successful housing product. Now, that's what we call being designers in industry. And it's, again, I think the New London Vernacular was a very perfectly reasonable attempt at an acceptable aesthetic that fits into the streetscape of London. Actually, it has a massive problem. Its massive problem is that it requires brick to be hung off frames with a gap between the layer of brick and the structural frame, which is increasing with the requirement to improve the rates of insulation. So these buildings are all struggling to hold up brick skins, which are now about half a meter away from the means of support, with massive steel angles. So the problem with this is that it results in an enormous amount of embodied carbon, first of all in the brick, but also at every slab edge, every story height, huge stainless steel angles, which are very expensive to make and very energy consuming to make in order to hold them up. So the message I'm trying to give is that there are means of production which are low energy, which involve making the product in comfort in factories and delivering them efficiently without thousands of separate, white van movements from separate factories to individual sites, is the solution. to effective delivery of low energy housing at scale, and can be done decoratively if that's what people want.
Yeah. So there's this idea here, as far as I can see, which is that this responsiveness that these means of production, this mechanized production of housing would enable, and it would obviously lead to potentially lead to the possibility of a bespokeness, which is really fascinating.
Yeah.
But it's not just that aspect of architectural production that you address in the book, and that is problematic for the profession. I mean, if we're trying to make architecture that helps people live good lives in which they are content, then there's also all these other systems within the process of architectural production, planning, the process of design itself, which still remains a very rarefied activity, procurement, of course, and then broader scale things like urban planning strategies and town planning strategies, which the public have no access to. I mean, the planning portal remains, despite the fact it's 2023, remains one of the most difficult to navigate public interfaces possible, and I don't think probably unintentionally. And then and I've said this before to others on this podcast, if you're trying to do a one-story extension for your kitchen at the back of your house in Penge, you'll have a planning officer all over you like white on rice. But if you're building 400 units of student housing on the edge of a conservation area, apparently there's very little they can't do, and very little.
I think
so. It's like how does the profession help people understand how the hell any of this is happening? How do we disambiguate the procedural complexities? How has HTA done it? And how is
those early days of community architecture in mass housing taught us how to do it. And to be perfectly honest with you, generally speaking, with the right kind of client and the right kind of resources, which we don't always get, it's always possible to do it. And I've written extensively on this, not in the book as it happens, but it's perfectly possible. And it's probably a subject for a whole separate podcast, but it does involve empowering and enabling the consumers of your work, regular engagement with them in a transparent and open and fair way, the offering of options to them, including, by the way, the option to do nothing, so that they understand very well what the implications are of simply resisting. And conversely, the opportunities for them of engaging. And in the end of the day, a ballot. You don't have to have this if you don't want it. And if there's a demonstrable majority, off we go, and everybody understands that, and it's incontrovertible. So there are other aspects to this, but overall, the message I'm trying to give is that in the right circumstances, with the right expertise and the resources, it's always possible to do it. I mean, I think one of the innovations that the Labour Party, if it gets in, might like to think about is, in addition to the necessity of ballots, which we're all used to and we've been campaigning for at HTA for many years on estate regeneration, we should always have ballots, around major regeneration projects on brownfield sites, because it's the people surrounding them that are immediately affected by them. And the corollary of that is that it would make developers think about the benefits for people living around major regeneration projects, and actually urban extensions as well. People are always concerned about the new, but in particular, they're concerned about the way the new impacts upon the existing. So, there's always a huge concern about, obviously traffic is a big one, but it's also, access to local schools, the health service, and all of those sorts of things, where they fear a negative impact upon the already threatened services that they wish from the infrastructure around them.
Yeah. I think that's a really interesting idea, sort of a radical democratic approach to foreground any form of architectural production. How does the architect work in this? In all of these frameworks you're talking about, in all of the 10 chapters in your book, there's this well, in the middle 8 chapters, shall we say, there is as I read it, a kind of emphasizing of the voices of the citizenry.
Yeah. The consumer.
The consumer. That's an interesting word. I would have thought when I was at university that would have got you a smack on the wrist. I think we use.
Yes, quite.
It's quite an interesting. Why do you choose that word?
It would. Oh well, because it's the right word. It wouldn't have got you a slap on the wrist at Google or Apple,
No.
would it? I mean, you think about the consumer and anticipating the consumer's needs, and neither of us would have anticipated, that we would become entirely dependent on an iPhone, would we? Because 10 years ago, I would have no idea what it's possible to do with one. So it's that point about anticipating people's needs and aspirations and such before they get to it themselves. That's the critical thing. But it is the consumer of, and there's a lot of the section of the chapter on let the people decide, as it's called, is actually not so much about the engagement in the development process, but it is about a better relationship between consumers and housing, and prop tech, and the opportunity for digital technologies to, and just about the only thing that Robert Jenrick got right, in my view, in his planned reforms of the planning system, was digitizing access to decision making and influencing the planning process for the consumers of it. But there are all sorts of other ways in which the digital economy can improve the relationship between consumers and the places where they live. All sorts of ways, huge improvements around the corner. And again, I think the profession has got to equip itself with an understanding of what that amounts to.
Yeah, sort of the BIMification of planning, where various people can feed in.
Well, it's the sharing economy, for example. We now share electric bikes and scooters around town, don't we? But we will soon be able to share energy, between our homes and our cars, and each other's homes and each other's cars. And we'll be able to share access to expensive tools and equipment, because it'll all be available online. I just think the opportunities for improving lives are immense. Mm-hmm. And by the way, the creation of consumer pull on the housing market, so that a better performing product becomes more attractive, and therefore suppliers become motivated to design better performing products. At the moment, the imbalance in supply and demand means that the industry can sit on its hands because they can sell everything they build.
How does the design process, as we currently understand it, respond to this? I think because I think it's wonderful. I mean, this idea of consumer pull, that's a very nice phrase. Thank you. I'm going to go back into crits in about 15 minutes, and I'm going to use that on the student because they're creating wonderful, imaginative designs, but at the same time, there isn't this concept, it would seem, in design itself, as we understand it as architects, how you do design, that is very future orientated. We do a lot of precedent study, we do a lot of walking backwards, we do a lot of stealing ideas, or replication, or quoting, or whatever you want to call it. But actually, how do you take a profession like architecture and future orientated, and then as a sort of final part of that, how do you start teaching this? How would you see Ben Derbyshire ex-REBA president and head of a massive architecture company. How would you like to see this articulated within design education?
I'd get the students out doing live projects, and the starting point for that would be to obtain their brief by asking people on the street or in neighborhoods that need renovation of one sort or another, what their needs and aspirations are, and then doing their best to supply answers and listening to the reaction. That's what I did when I was a student. When I was at Birmingham School of Architecture, which had a very sort of technical approach, I was out there in Saltley and places like that, working with community groups. And then I left and went to Cambridge, and I went to Cambridge not particularly because it was aspirational to be at an Oxbridge college, but because there was no curriculum at all. So I was able to spend my entire fifth year in Spitalfields trying to figure out, what the future for a place like that, which is full of delicate heritage on the one hand, and a pretty robust means of clothes production as it was then, on the other. That's back in 1975 or 6, a long time ago. But so no, I mean, I think it's placing ourselves in real life situations and trying to meet people's real needs.
Okay, I think we'll leave it there. That was fantastic. Thank you so very much, Ben. I've really, really enjoyed speaking to you, and thanks for the book.
Can I ask you a question before we part?
Oh my days. Yes, go on.
Well, I'm interested to know. I wrote this book because I wanted young, aspiring architects to, as I say, understand that there's an interesting future in anticipating needs and aspirations, and it's all deliverable, and it is moral and ethical and necessary. And I find actually so far, I presented it to the London School of Architecture only this week. I'd like to know what you think about whether and how it might resonate with the young minds that you teach.
I'm constantly amazed. It's the privilege of my position in education. I'm constantly amazed at how good they are. That they want to be good, and this is something they want to do. They're very conscious of, Gen Z are very conscious of their identity and who they are, and having that respected, which means that they get that they're very conscious, as far as I can tell, not universally, I'm talking in very broad brush here, but very conscious of the lack of justice at the point that it intersects with them and their groups. And it's very clear that a book like yours, Home Truth, with its great focus around housing and housing justice, you might call it, or spatial justice, is very relevant. It's very important. And what I like about the book particularly is that you have skin in the game, because you're a practitioner, because you've spent a long time thinking about this, and then, as you say, got into the hot seat, which must be bloody hard being reproduced. But so it's not an academic book in that sense.
No, it's not.
It's not kind of an abstract kind of hypothesizing, but it's also not. But it's also not playing that kind of. I don't know. When you've got skin in the game, when you've got a dog in the fight, there's a kind of imperative to the way that things are written, which is kind of exciting and enticing. And I think that this book has. And it's also not written in architectural jargonese hieroglyphs, so you can get into it. So that, yeah, the way I see it, and the thing that excites me, because I lead the masters here at Kent School of Architecture, and the thing that excites me is just that appetite. They've got an appetite for the common good, and I think it's really exciting. What worries me is that we, as a profession, as an educational profession in architecture, don't reflect on what that means in terms of the way that we formulate design projects, the we've got this new restructuring of the education to enable broader access, but it hasn't really, and this is because the ARB doesn't have this, as far as I can see, doesn't seem to have this kind of competence. It doesn't really start driving forward thematically requisite changes. Like we should be focused on housing. Like housing should be a substantive component of what we do.
Completely agree.
Yeah. And we should be looking at, architects should be trained in urban planning.
Yeah,
100%.
I agree with that too.
Yeah.
Good. Well, I'm encouraged by that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
I'll try and go on tour.
Go on tour, yeah, go on. Get yourself a bus, get yourself a drinks cabinet, go on tour. Thank you ever so much, Ben. I really enjoyed it.
Okay, thank you very, very much indeed.
Jolly good stuff. Thank you to Ben for the chat, the book, the time and the work. Please see the podcast descriptions for links to the book, to Ben at HTA, and to a wee New London Architecture interview he gave in 2022. Don't forget to share this episode wherever you go, and thanks for listening. Cheers.